The air was thick with the icy grip of early winter, a cold that seemed to penetrate straight to the bone. In the dim light of an overcast sky, Jake McKinley moved with an unhurried, deliberate pace. This was not the first time his name had been associated with unspeakable acts, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Among the locals, Jake was a figure whose very mention caused an uneasy silence to fall. His reputation as a man devoid of empathy and consumed by cruelty was both earned and well known. It wasn't that Jake McKinley had suffered through some tragic origin story or fallen victim to the cruelty of life himself. It was simply that he took a twisted pleasure in wielding control and inflicting suffering. And now, as he stood in the shadow of the railway tracks cutting through the wilderness, his next act of depravity was unfolding. At his feet lay a massive brown bear, her breath labored and shallow. She was injured. Deep, jagged wounds marred her flank, the result of one of Jake's traps. He had set them earlier in the week, hidden in the undergrowth near the forest's edge, hoping to catch whatever unlucky creature wandered into their path. It could have been a deer, a coyote, or even a wolf, but it was this bear that had been unfortunate enough to fall victim to his malicious design. The trap had done its work well, clamping down on her flesh and robbing her of the ability to escape. The struggle she had put up was evident from the marks in the snow and dirt, the way her claws had raked through the ground in a desperate bid for freedom. But the struggle had only exhausted her further, leaving her a broken, bleeding shadow of the powerful animal she once was. A short distance away, 3 small cubs huddled together, trembling with fear. Their eyes darted toward their mother, seeking comfort and safety, but finding none. The cubs let out soft, plaintive cries, their tiny bodies pressed tightly against one another in a futile attempt to ward off the cold and the terror that filled the air around them. Jake's sharp eyes flicked toward them, his lips curling into a sneer. To him, they weren't living beings, not in the sense that mattered. They were props, pawns in the grotesque spectacle he was about to orchestrate. From the back of his rusted pickup truck, Jake pulled out a length of heavy chain. The metal links rattled against each other as he dropped the bundle onto the ground with a dull clang, the sound reverberating through the stillness of the forest. The bear stirred at the noise, lifting her head weakly to look at him. Her eyes, dark and glistening with pain, locked onto his, and for a moment, there was a strange, unspoken connection between predator and prey. But Jake was no predator in the natural sense. He was a man who thrived on dominance and the suffering of others. Whatever flicker of understanding might have passed between them was snuffed out as he grabbed one end of the chain and began his grim work. The bear let out a low growl as Jake approached, her remaining strength summoned in a final act of defiance. But it was a pitiful sound, more of a whimper than a threat. Jake laughed, a harsh, guttural noise that cut through the cold air like a blade. "Save it," he muttered, his voice devoid of compassion. "You're not going anywhere." He knelt beside the bear, his hands working quickly and efficiently despite the cold that made his fingers stiff. First, he wrapped the chain around her neck, the metal biting into her fur and pressing against her skin. The bear flinched at the contact, a shudder rippling through her massive frame. Jake tightened the chain, securing it with a lock that clicked shut with a chilling finality. He moved to her legs next, binding them together with another length of chain. The bear struggled weakly, her claws scraping against the frozen ground, but it was no use. Jake's strength and the weight of the chains rendered her efforts futile. Once the mother was immobilized, Jake turned his attention to the cubs. They tried to scurry away as he approached, their small bodies trembling with fear, but they didn't get far. Jake caught them one by one, his hands rough and unrelenting as he dragged them back to the tracks. They cried out, their tiny voices high-pitched and desperate, but Jake was unmoved. If anything, their cries seemed to amuse him. "Shut up," he snarled, though his tone held a twisted sort of glee. "You're just making this more fun." He used smaller chains for the cubs, wrapping them around their necks and securing them to the tracks in a grotesque parody of collars. The cubs thrashed and squirmed, their movements frantic, but they were no match for Jake's brute force. When all 3 were chained in place, Jake stepped back to survey his work. The mother bear lay on the tracks, her body heaving with exhaustion and pain. Her cubs were lined up beside her, their tiny forms dwarfed by the massive steel rails and the looming figure of Jake McKinley. The scene was one of pure, unfiltered cruelty, a tableau of suffering created by a man who saw himself as the master of all he surveyed. Jake lit a cigarette, the glow of the flame briefly illuminating his face. He exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes glinting with satisfaction as he took in the sight before him. For Jake, this wasn't just about killing. It was about control, about asserting his dominance over creatures that had no way of fighting back. It was about the thrill of playing God, of deciding who lived and who died. He adjusted the chains one last time, ensuring they were tight and secure. The mother bear let out a low, mournful sound, a mixture of pain and despair that seemed to echo through the forest. Her cubs cried out in response, their voices filled with the kind of terror that only comes from knowing you are powerless. But Jake didn't hear their cries as pleas for mercy. To him, they were the soundtrack to his victory. Standing there, Jake felt a surge of pride in what he had done. It wasn't enough to simply kill. It had to be done with spectacle, with a touch of theater. And as the cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the scent of blood and fear, Jake McKinley stood tall, the self-proclaimed master of his domain. The sun rose slowly over the jagged peaks of the mountain range, bathing the landscape in a soft, golden glow. Wildlife photographer Mark Walton crouched low in the brush, his camera poised and ready. The serenity of the wilderness at dawn was a scene he had captured countless times, yet it never failed to stir something deep within him. The rhythmic chirping of birds, the faint rustle of the wind through the trees, and the crisp air of the early morning all came together to create a sense of peace that he rarely found elsewhere. This was why he loved his work, why he rose before dawn and trekked into the wild. This was where life felt most vivid. Mark adjusted his camera, aiming it at a ridgeline where the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon. His fingers moved deftly over the settings, honing in on the perfect shot. He breathed in deeply, savoring the stillness. As he peered through the lens, he could see the mist lifting from the valley below, revealing patches of forest, rocky outcroppings, and the faint glimmer of the railway tracks that cut through the wilderness like a scar. Suddenly, something in the corner of his frame caught his attention. A shape, dark and unnatural, stood out starkly against the soft hues of the morning landscape. Lowering his camera, Mark squinted toward the railway tracks, his curiosity piqued. He raised his binoculars, bringing the distant object into focus. What he saw made his stomach tighten. There, lying prone across the tracks, was a massive brown bear. Her body looked battered and still, but it was not the stillness of death. She was alive, her chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. Chains wrapped cruelly around her neck and legs, securing her to the steel rails. Nearby, 3 small cubs huddled together, their tiny bodies trembling against the cold metal. They moved slightly, their wide eyes filled with fear as they pressed close to their mother, seeking comfort and protection that she could no longer provide. Mark felt a jolt of disbelief. He blinked, hoping he was imagining things, but the scene remained unchanged. A bear, injured, chained, and helpless, lay stranded on the tracks, her cubs beside her. The sight was incomprehensible. His mind reeled, trying to piece together the why and how of what he was seeing. What kind of person would do this? What cruelty could drive someone to inflict such torment on a creature of the wild, let alone a mother and her defenseless young? Lowering his binoculars, Mark felt his pulse quicken. He glanced around, as though expecting to find the perpetrator lurking nearby, but the landscape was empty save for the quiet stirrings of nature. The only sound was the distant call of a bird, a stark contrast to the horrific tableau before him. The bear moved slightly, her massive frame shuddering as she attempted to lift her head. The movement was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to spur Mark into action. Without a second thought, he threw his camera and gear into his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and began scrambling down the hillside toward the tracks. His boots slipped on the frost-covered grass, the uneven ground threatening to send him tumbling, but he didn't care. Every second counted. He didn't know when the next train might come, and the thought of what could happen if he hesitated made his stomach churn. As he descended, Mark's thoughts raced. What would he do when he got there? He had no tools, no equipment to break the chains or free the bear. But he couldn't let that stop him. There had to be something he could do, some way to help. He pushed the doubts aside, focusing instead on closing the distance between himself and the tracks. The terrain was rough, the slope steeper than it had appeared from above. Mark grabbed at tree branches and rocks for support, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he navigated the descent. The chains around the bear's body glinted in the sunlight, a harsh reminder of the urgency of the situation. The cubs huddled closer to their mother, their small cries audible now as Mark drew nearer. The sound was heartbreaking, a mixture of fear and confusion that only added to the weight pressing down on his chest. When he finally reached the edge of the tracks, Mark paused, his heart pounding. Up close, the scene was even more harrowing than it had appeared from a distance. The bear's fur was matted with blood, her massive body crisscrossed with scratches and cuts. The chains dug into her flesh, leaving raw, red marks where they had been pulled tight. Her eyes, half closed and glassy with pain, flicked toward him as he approached. For a moment, their gazes met, and Mark felt a surge of something he couldn't quite describe. It was as though she was pleading with him, silently begging for help. "It's okay," he said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. His voice trembled slightly, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm here to help you." The bear let out a low growl, a sound that rumbled deep in her chest. It wasn't a threat. It was the only way she could communicate her distress. Mark took a cautious step closer, his eyes darting to the cubs. They stared back at him, their tiny bodies pressed tightly against their mother's side. They were so small, so vulnerable. The sight of them chained like prisoners filled Mark with a fury that threatened to boil over. How could someone do this? How could they look at these creatures and see anything but beauty, innocence, and life? He knelt beside the bear, examining the chains. They were thick and rusted, the kind of industrial-strength links used for securing heavy machinery. He traced the length of the chain to the padlocks that held them in place, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to break them. He didn't have any tools. Not for this. His multi-tool was in his pack, but it was useless against something this heavy. Mark glanced over his shoulder, scanning the area for anything he could use. Rocks, metal scraps, anything that might serve as a makeshift hammer or lever. His eyes landed on a length of rebar lying in the grass near the tracks, and he grabbed it without hesitation. Turning back to the bear, he lifted the rebar and hesitated for a moment, his hands shaking. He had no idea if this would work, but he had to try. Mark's hands trembled as he gripped the length of rebar, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold morning air. The massive brown bear, chained and bleeding, let out a low, agonized growl as her cubs whimpered beside her. The cold steel links that bound her to the tracks seemed unyielding, a cruel, deliberate prison. Every moment that passed felt like an eternity, and Mark knew he didn't have the luxury of time. In the distance, the faint, ominous rumble of a train grew louder. He had to act fast. Mark dropped to his knees beside the bear, the rebar in his hands, feeling absurdly inadequate for the task ahead. The chains were heavy, rusted, and secured with industrial-grade padlocks that would have required bolt cutters to remove. But Mark had no bolt cutters. All he had was his sheer determination and a piece of scrap metal he'd picked up near the tracks. He glanced down the railway, his heart pounding as the vibrations beneath him grew stronger. The train was still far enough away that he couldn't see it, but he could feel it in the ground, a relentless force that would not stop for anything. "I'll get you out of here," he muttered, more to himself than to the bear. He didn't know if she could understand the soothing tone of his voice, but he hoped it would at least calm her a little. Her massive, pain-filled eyes flicked toward him, and for a brief moment, he felt the weight of her desperation. She was depending on him, and so were her cubs. He couldn't fail them. Mark positioned the rebar against the first lock, bracing it as best he could. With all his strength, he brought the metal bar down, striking the padlock. The clang of metal on metal rang out across the tracks, echoing through the valley. The bear flinched at the noise, her muscles tensing beneath the chains, but Mark didn't stop. He struck again and again, each blow sending shocks up his arms. His hands burned, and his grip faltered as the vibrations rattled through his bones, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. The train's whistle pierced the air, a sharp, chilling sound that sent a jolt of panic through him. It was closer now. Too close. "Come on," he growled, his voice strained as he slammed the rebar against the lock with renewed force. Sweat dripped into his eyes, blurring his vision, but he blinked it away and focused on the task at hand. The padlock was dented but still intact, its rusted surface mocking his efforts. Mark let out a frustrated yell, shifting his position to get a better angle. He raised the rebar high and brought it down with every ounce of strength he had, the sound of the impact reverberating through the air. Finally, with a sharp crack, the lock gave way. The chain around the bear's neck slackened, falling away with a heavy thud. Mark barely had time to catch his breath before turning his attention to the chains around her legs. His hands were raw and blistered, his arms screaming in protest, but he didn't let himself slow down. He couldn't afford to. The vibrations beneath the tracks were stronger now, the ground shaking with the approaching train's relentless momentum. The whistle blared again, louder this time, as if warning him that time was running out. Mark risked a glance down the tracks and felt his stomach drop. The train's headlights were visible now, cutting through the mist like the eyes of some monstrous beast. It was coming fast, its engine roaring as it thundered toward them. "Damn it!" Mark hissed, his voice rising in desperation. He fumbled with the rebar, his hands slick with sweat and blood from where the metal had torn into his skin. The cubs cried louder, their tiny voices filled with panic, and the mother bear let out a deep, guttural roar as if urging him to hurry. Mark's heart raced as he worked frantically to free her legs, each strike of the rebar a desperate plea for time to slow down. One chain broke, then another. The bear's legs were free now, but the cubs were still bound to the tracks. Mark scrambled toward them, his vision narrowing as adrenaline took over. He barely registered the roar of the train growing louder behind him, the sound drowning out everything else. All he could see were the terrified faces of the cubs, their small bodies trembling as they struggled against their bonds. "It's okay. I've got you," Mark said, his voice breaking as he grabbed the first lock. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him a moment to position the rebar correctly. The train's whistle screamed again, a deafening roar that sent a wave of terror through him. He struck the lock, the impact jarring his arms, but it didn't budge. He hit it again and again, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The train was almost upon them now, the ground trembling violently beneath his knees. Mark's vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out from the sheer intensity of it all. But then, with a final, desperate swing, the lock snapped open. He ripped the chain away from the first cub and moved to the second, his movements frantic as the train's headlights bore down on them. "Go!" he shouted, his voice hoarse as he pushed the freed cub toward its mother. The bear was on her feet now, her massive frame swaying with exhaustion as she roared at the approaching train. The second lock broke, and Mark shoved the second cub toward her, his hands shaking so badly that he almost dropped the rebar. The train was so close now that Mark could feel the heat of its engine, the wind from its passage whipping around him. The whistle blared one last time, a deafening scream that seemed to pierce his very soul. Mark lunged for the third cub, his hands fumbling with the lock as the train's headlights engulfed them in blinding light. With a final, desperate swing, the lock broke. Mark grabbed the cub and stumbled backward, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. The bear let out a deafening roar, her massive paw reaching out as if to pull him to safety. Mark pushed the last cub toward her and threw himself off the tracks, the train roaring past just as his body hit the ground. For a moment, there was silence. The train disappeared into the distance, its whistle fading into the morning air. Mark lay in the grass, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The bear and her cubs stood nearby, their eyes fixed on him. He could see the gratitude in the mother bear's gaze, a silent acknowledgement of what he had done. Mark closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a wave. They were safe. For now, that was enough. Mark Walton sat on his cabin's front porch, staring at the distant mountains. His hands were still raw and blistered from the rescue, and the events of the morning replayed in his mind on an endless loop. No matter how many times he tried to shake it off, one thought haunted him. This was no accident. Those chains, the heavy industrial padlocks, the deliberate placement on the tracks. It was clear that someone had done this intentionally. Someone had looked at a living, breathing animal and decided to turn her and her cubs into victims of a cruel, calculated act. The idea sickened him. Mark had spent years photographing wildlife, documenting the beauty and rawness of the natural world. He had seen the circle of life play out countless times, predators hunting prey, animals competing for survival. But this was different. This wasn't nature. It was human cruelty at its worst. The thought of the bear, which he had started to call Berdicia in his mind, lingered with him. She and her cubs had been through unimaginable terror, and Mark couldn't stop wondering who had done this and why. He clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening as frustration bubbled within him. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the sky in shades of orange and purple, Mark decided to pay his neighbor Richard a visit. Richard was an older man, rugged and weathered by years spent in the mountains. He had lived in the area longer than anyone else and knew more about the local wildlife and the people who roamed these forests than most would care to admit. If anyone could shed light on what had happened, it would be him. Mark grabbed his coat and headed down the narrow dirt path that connected their properties. The crisp night air stung his face, and the distant howl of a wolf echoed through the valley, a reminder of how close to the wild they truly were. When he reached Richard's cabin, the older man was sitting on a wooden stool by a small fire pit, whittling a piece of wood with his pocket knife. "Evening, Mark," Richard said, not looking up from his work. "What brings you out this way?" Mark hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, his voice low and tense. "I need to talk to you about something I saw this morning." Richard raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for Mark to continue. Taking a deep breath, Mark launched into the story, recounting every detail of the bear and her cubs chained to the tracks, the frantic rescue, and the heavy feeling that had settled in his chest ever since. When he finished, Richard sat silently for a moment, his knife still poised over the piece of wood. Then he let out a long, slow exhale and leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the fire. "I knew it," Richard muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "Damn it, I knew something was off." Mark frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" Richard set the piece of wood aside and looked up at Mark, his expression grim. "Jake McKinley," he said, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "I've suspected that bastard for years. He's always lurking around these woods, setting traps, acting like he owns the place. I've caught him doing shady stuff more times than I can count, but I could never prove it." Mark's pulse quickened. "What kind of shady stuff?" Richard leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Illegal trapping mostly, selling animals on the black market, sometimes dead, sometimes alive. Bears, wolves, even deer, whatever he can get his hands on. There's money in it, Mark. Big money. And Jake's not the kind of man to care about the consequences." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. "You think he did this? Chained that bear and her cubs to the tracks?" "I don't just think it," Richard said, his eyes blazing with anger. "I'd bet my life on it. That's the kind of sick game he'd play, especially if he thought he could make a buck out of it." Mark's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He thought back to the chains, the way they'd been secured, the deliberate cruelty of the whole scene. It fit with what Richard was saying, and the realization made his blood boil. "We can't let him get away with this," Mark said, his voice shaking with anger. "If he's out there trapping animals, torturing them for profit, someone has to stop him." Richard nodded slowly. "I've been wanting to take him down for years, but I never had anyone willing to help me. If you're serious about this, Mark, then we're going to need proof. Real proof, something that'll hold up in court." Mark met his gaze, his determination hardening. "Tell me what I need to do." "Over the next hour, The two men hatched a plan. Richard explained that Jake had a cabin deeper in the woods, a place where he supposedly stored his traps and whatever animals he managed to catch. If they could get inside and find evidence, photos, documents, anything that tied Jake to the illegal trade, they could take it to the authorities. But it wouldn't be easy. Jake was smart, cunning, and always one step ahead of anyone who tried to cross him. His cabin was likely rigged with alarms or traps of its own, and he wasn't the type to take kindly to trespassers. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked as they finalized their plan. "This isn't just some wildlife photo shoot, Mark. Jake's dangerous. If he catches us snooping around, there's no telling what he'll do." Mark didn't hesitate. "I'm sure. Berdicia and her cubs didn't go through hell just so that bastard could walk away scot-free. He has to pay for what he's done." Richard gave him a long, searching look, then nodded. "All right then, let's do this." As Mark walked back to his cabin that night, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew the risks, knew that confronting someone like Jake was playing with fire. But he also knew that he couldn't stand by and do nothing. Berdicia's terrified eyes, the sight of her cubs, chained and helpless, haunted him. He owed it to them to see this through, no matter what. The woods were dark and silent as Mark reached his porch, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He paused, glancing over his shoulder, but the shadows betrayed nothing. Shaking off the unease, he stepped inside, locking the door behind him. Tomorrow, the investigation would begin, and with it, a battle against the darkness that had taken root in these mountains. The dense forest was shrouded in darkness, its silence broken only by the crunch of Mark Walton's boots and the soft whispers of Richard behind him. The two men moved cautiously, their flashlights casting narrow beams that danced across the underbrush. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the very forest resisted their intrusion. Ahead of them lay their target, Jake McKinley's cabin, a shadowy structure hidden deep in the wilderness, far from prying eyes. Mark tightened his grip on the camera slung around his neck, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on his shoulders. Over the past week, he and Richard had pieced together what little they knew about Jake's operation. Richard had been right. Jake wasn't working alone. There were whispers in the nearby town about a network of poachers and traders who dealt in wildlife, turning the beauty of the mountains into a profitable but brutal industry. And Jake, with his reputation for cruelty and cunning, was at the center of it. Their plan was simple but dangerous. Get inside the cabin, document the evidence, and get out before Jake or his accomplices returned. It sounded straightforward enough, but the risks were enormous. Jake was a man with nothing to lose, and Mark had no doubt that he'd resort to violence if he caught them snooping around. As they approached the edge of the clearing, Richard raised a hand, signaling Mark to stop. The older man crouched low, his sharp eyes scanning the area. Mark followed his lead, his heart pounding as he peered through the dense foliage. The cabin loomed ahead, a dark, foreboding silhouette against the night sky. No lights were visible from the windows, and the surrounding area appeared deserted. "All clear," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let's move." The two men crept forward, keeping to the shadows as they crossed the clearing. Mark's pulse raced with every step, his senses on high alert for any sign of movement. They reached the cabin without incident, and Richard gestured for Mark to follow him around to the back. There, they found a small, padlocked door leading to what appeared to be a basement or storage area. "This is it," Richard muttered, pulling a set of lock-picking tools from his pocket. He knelt in front of the door, his hands steady as he worked on the lock. Mark stood guard, his eyes darting nervously between the trees and the cabin's windows. The night was eerily quiet, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open. Richard pushed the door ajar, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint, acrid smell of decay. Mark swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the flashlight as he followed Richard inside. The basement was worse than they had imagined. The walls were lined with cages, some empty, others filled with the skeletal remains of animals long dead. Chains and restraints hung from the ceiling, their rusted surfaces stained with blood. A workbench cluttered with tools, traps, and other sinister devices dominated the center of the room. But it was the corner of the basement that made Mark's stomach turn. A freezer unit, humming softly, with the unmistakable smell of death wafting from it. Richard's face hardened as he surveyed the scene. "This is it," he said grimly. "This is what we needed." Mark didn't respond. He was already moving, his camera clicking as he documented every horrifying detail. The cages, the traps, the bloodstains. He captured it all, knowing that every image could be the key to bringing Jake to justice. Richard joined him, carefully sifting through the papers and ledgers piled on the workbench. Most of it was indecipherable at a glance. Lists of names, coded entries, and figures that seemed to correspond to transactions. "This bastard's been keeping records," Richard muttered, holding up a ledger. "If we can figure out what this means, we might be able to track down the rest of his operation." Mark nodded, his attention focused on photographing the ledgers and any other documents he could find. They worked quickly but methodically, their urgency mounting with every passing minute. The thought of Jake returning, of being caught in the act, hung over them like a storm cloud, but they couldn't afford to leave anything behind. As they finished documenting the evidence, a noise outside made both men freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approached the cabin. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he exchanged a panicked look with Richard. "Upstairs," Richard mouthed, gesturing toward the staircase. They moved quickly but silently, slipping out of the basement and into the main level of the cabin. There, they hid behind an overturned table, their hearts pounding as the front door creaked open. Jake's voice carried through the cabin, low and gruff. "You checked the traps?" he barked, addressing someone outside. "Yeah," came the reply. "Couple of good catches tonight. They'll sell easy." Mark's stomach turned as he listened to the exchange, the full scope of Jake's operation becoming horrifyingly clear. He and Richard stayed perfectly still, their breath shallow, as Jake and his accomplice moved through the cabin. The men didn't go down to the basement, but the threat of discovery was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity. When the two finally left, slamming the door behind them, Mark and Richard waited for several agonizing minutes before daring to move. They slipped out through a side window, their movements as silent as shadows, and disappeared into the forest. Only when they were safely back at Richard's cabin did they allow themselves to breathe freely. Over the next week, Mark and Richard worked tirelessly to analyze the evidence they had gathered. They pieced together Jake's network, identifying several of his accomplices and the buyers he supplied. When they finally presented their findings to the authorities, the response was immediate. Armed with search warrants and backed by wildlife agencies, law enforcement raided Jake's cabin and the properties of his associates. The arrests were swift and decisive. Jake McKinley, the man who had terrorized the wilderness for profit, was dragged out of his cabin in handcuffs, his face twisted in rage. His accomplices fared no better, their illegal operations exposed for all to see. The mountain community, once plagued by whispers of poaching and cruelty, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. For Mark, the victory was bittersweet. He thought of Berdicia and her cubs, of the terror they had endured, and felt a deep, lingering sadness. But he also felt pride in standing up for those who couldn't fight for themselves, in bringing a monster to justice. As he stood at the edge of the forest, watching the sunrise once more, he knew he had done the right thing. The soft rustling of leaves in the wind filled the air as Mark Walton leaned against the sturdy wooden fence of his wildlife sanctuary. It had been weeks since the harrowing events that led to the bear's rescue, but the images of that day remained vivid in his mind. The bear, now called Grace, lay in a large, shaded enclosure with her 3 cubs, their once terrified eyes now calm and curious as they explored their new surroundings. The change in them was profound, yet the weight of what they had endured still hung in the air like a shadow. Grace had been brought to Mark's sanctuary immediately after her rescue. It was the only place in the area equipped to handle animals in such dire condition. The injuries she sustained from the chains had been severe, with deep wounds around her neck and legs that required immediate medical attention. Mark had worked tirelessly with a local wildlife veterinarian to treat her, cleaning and stitching her wounds while ensuring her cubs were safe and healthy. The cubs, though unharmed physically, clung to their mother for comfort, their small bodies trembling whenever a human came too close. In the days following their arrival, Grace had been wary and defensive, her massive frame stiffening whenever Mark entered the enclosure to bring food or check on her progress. Her growls were low and guttural, a warning to keep his distance, and Mark respected her boundaries. He understood her fear. After all, humans had been the source of her torment. But he also knew that time and care could bridge the gap between her instinctual distrust and the realization that she was safe. It wasn't easy. The sanctuary was a haven for animals that had been abused, injured, or displaced, and Mark was no stranger to the challenges of rehabilitation. Yet Grace presented a unique challenge. She wasn't just a victim of cruelty. She was a mother, and the added responsibility of protecting her cubs had left her hyper-vigilant and exhausted. Mark often spent hours sitting quietly outside her enclosure, letting her grow accustomed to his presence. He spoke to her in soothing tones, his voice steady and calm, even when she didn't appear to listen. "You're safe now," he would say, his words as much for himself as for her. "No one's going to hurt you again." The breakthrough came one evening, weeks into her recovery. Mark had been bringing fresh fish and berries to the enclosure when Grace's gaze met his, her dark eyes softening ever so slightly. It was a fleeting moment, but it spoke volumes. Slowly, Grace began to trust him. Her growls ceased, and she no longer backed away when he approached the fence. The cubs, emboldened by their mother's change in demeanor, began to venture closer, their tiny noses sniffing the air as they curiously eyed the man who had saved them. Mark named the cubs Hope, Ember, and Scout, their playful energy a stark contrast to the horrors they had experienced. They tumbled over one another in the grass, chasing insects and wrestling with clumsy enthusiasm. Watching them, Mark felt a swell of pride and relief. Grace had protected them through unimaginable circumstances, and now they had a chance to grow and thrive. Despite their progress, the scars of their ordeal were not easily forgotten. Grace's injuries healed slowly, the marks on her neck and legs serving as a permanent reminder of what she had endured. Mark often found himself grappling with anger at the cruelty that had brought her to this point, but he channeled that anger into action. He shared Grace's story with wildlife organizations and local communities, raising awareness about the dangers of poaching and the importance of protecting wildlife. The sanctuary became a hub of activity as news of Grace and her cubs spread. Journalists, activists, and wildlife enthusiasts flocked to hear their story, moved by the bear's resilience and the efforts that had gone into saving her. Mark allowed limited visits, careful to ensure that the attention didn't disrupt Grace's recovery. He knew the world needed to see her, to understand the depths of human cruelty, but also the power of compassion and second chances. Months passed, and Grace's strength returned. Her fur grew glossy, her muscles regained their power, and her movements became confident and fluid. The cubs, now strong and lively, mimicked their mother's every move, learning the skills they would need to survive in the wild. Mark knew the time was approaching when he would have to let them go. It was a bittersweet realization. He had grown attached to them, their presence a daily reminder of why he did what he did. But Grace and her cubs didn't belong behind fences. They belonged to the wilderness. The day of their release dawned clear and bright. Mark had chosen a remote, protected area deep in the mountains, far from the reach of poachers or human interference. The transport was carefully planned, with Grace sedated briefly to ensure her safety during the journey. As they arrived at the release site, Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. The enclosure doors were opened, and Grace emerged cautiously, her cubs close behind her. For a moment, she paused, her massive frame silhouetted against the trees as she surveyed her surroundings. Mark watched, his heart heavy and full at the same time. He couldn't help but whisper, "Go on, Grace. You're free now." She turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his one last time. It was a look filled with understanding, gratitude, and something else, something almost regal. Then, with a powerful stride, she moved forward, her cubs following in her wake. They disappeared into the forest, their silhouettes swallowed by the trees until all that remained was the sound of rustling leaves. Grace's story didn't end there. She became a symbol of hope and resilience, her tale spreading far beyond the sanctuary. Mark continued to speak about her at events and through wildlife organizations, advocating for stricter laws against poaching and greater efforts to protect endangered species. Grace's release marked not just her freedom, but a victory for kindness over cruelty, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, compassion could prevail. Back at the sanctuary, Mark stood in the now-empty enclosure, his thoughts drifting to Berdicia's dark eyes and the playful cubs who had once tumbled through the grass. He missed them, but he also knew they were where they belonged. The mountains were their home, and they were finally free to live as they were meant to. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange, Mark felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Grace and her cubs had triumphed against unimaginable odds, and their story would continue to inspire for years to come.